Okay, the Civil War in the United States is another way of glimpsing Marx's views about nationalism and ethnicity. His writings there are... Now, as I mentioned before, Marx wrote for the New York Tribune, which was a left-liberal, anti-slavery newspaper whose progressiveness puts the stand of the New York Times today to shame. I mean, they really were a progressive newspaper, and they published Karl Marx. And people often think that, well, they only published like stuff that didn't talk about capitalism or workers' uprisings. No, he talked about all that kind of stuff, and it was published in the Tribune. Now, as the Civil War got underway in Britain, the working class tended to support the Union side, but the aristocracy and other social groups that were quite powerful supported the South, partly for economic reasons, the cotton coming from the South, but that's over. Marx thought that was overrated because grain was also coming from the North. But it was more like don't forget, U.S. was the only even semi-democratic country in the world at that time. The typical article in the London Times in the 1860s would say, yeah, the U.S. is breaking apart. It shows this idea of Republican form of government. It just doesn't work. And thank God we have a monarchy where very few people can actually vote. That would be a typical kind of thing you'd read in the conservative British press. There was also attempts to intervene. There was an incident with a British ship that was stopped, and some Confederate officers were taken off that ship, and so on. And so this was a violation of Britain. Imagine like if Nicaragua once had stopped the American ship. So there was that kind of reaction. And so during those periods, British workers held huge public meetings where they said they didn't want any intervention on the side of the South. And the conservative propaganda said, if we intervene in the war, help the South to remain independent, the cotton will start flowing again, and you'll go back to work, because the Civil War created an immediate depression in the factories of Britain, which were heavily, at that time, clothing and textile. So these public meetings, workers would pass resolutions saying that even at the cost of not being able to go back to work right away, they did not want the South to win the war, and there should be no intervention by Britain, and they supported the Northern cause. And Marx's writings, he talks about this, but he's also constantly critical of Lincoln for temporizing, for not really wanting to wage the war seriously, for not wanting to say initially that the slaves are going to be freed, for not wanting to use black troops, and so on. And Marx is talking about the possibility of a slave revolution. Like, why isn't the North trying to foment that? Or he thinks at some points he thinks that is going to take place, especially after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which he's very happy about. So, but then in terms of the U.S., he also talks about slavery, and this is in Capital. This is right in Capital, Volume 1. These couple sentences. In the United States of America, every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured part of the republic. Labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin. However, a new life for labor immediately arose from the death of slavery, and then he talks about the first National Labor Congress that was held in 1866 in the United States. Now, this stuff is all fairly well known as a book, Marx and Engels on the Civil War in the United States. It's been in print in English since before I was born. But not everything is in there. And here's something that's not in there. The 1865 address to the American people. There was an address to Lincoln at one point, but this is the address to the American people when the First International has become, pretty much disgusted with the government of the United States. This is when Andrew Johnson is president. So this is the address to the American people, or part of it. Now, Marx didn't write this, but he has certainly approved it, and it was part of the First International, in which he had tremendous influence. So here's the crucial sentences. Open letter to the people of the United States. Let your citizens of today be declared free and equal without reserve. If you fail to give them citizens' rights while you demand citizens' duties, there will yet remain a struggle for the future which may again stain your country with your people's blood. So that's, pretty stark warning. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is Ireland. Now, these again, most of these writings are collected in a volume, Marx and Engels on Ireland, the Irish Question. Now, most of these collections are based on collections put out in the Soviet Union, assembled there, and then later issued in English by international publishers. For some reason, they never had one of those on Poland. They didn't widely circulate that, and you can think about why that might have been. But Marx's writings on Ireland, especially around 1870, constitute his most theoretically sophisticated and developed discussion of the interweaving of class, nationalism, race, and ethnicity that you could see also in the Poland writings and the writings on the Civil War in America. Now, he and Engels always supported the Irish struggle. From their earliest writings, they support independence for Ireland, they support the Irish nationalist movement, they support the struggle for the rights of Irish workers inside Britain. Now, in the international, there's another fight over this case over Ireland, over one of these kind of political questions. And this is what really people don't, I've never seen anyone else refer to this yet. I've looked and I haven't seen anyone yet. So it's in my book and detailed there, but the first real fight between Marx and Bakunin is over Ireland. The First International is very involved in Britain in petitions to the Queen, who has the power to pardon, because Irish revolutionaries are in prison and about to be executed. And so they write these petitions, they get labor leaders to sign them, send them to the Queen, pardon or at least don't execute these men. Now, Bakunin's group publishes an attack that says the working class should not get involved in non-class issues like defense of Irish nationalists, and absolutely should never write a petition to Queen Victoria, because we don't recognize her. Okay. And so Marx thought differently. Marx thought that this issue was intimately connected with the struggle of the British working class. And there's a debate with Bakunin, and Marx wrote, in the context of that debate, he writes one of his most interesting conceptualizations of the relationship of ethnicity, of ethnic oppression to class consciousness, and so forth. Now, he indicates also that he's changed his position. He used to think that Britain would have a revolution by the workers and then they would free Ireland. But now he says he's reversing his position. I've become more and more convinced, and the thing now is to drum this conviction into the English working class, that they will never do anything decisive here in England before they separate their attitude towards Ireland quite definitely from that of the ruling classes and make common cause with the Irish. Every movement in England itself is crippled by the dissension with the Irish, who form a very important section of the working class in England itself. Then he goes on, elsewhere he writes, that English working class consciousness was attenuated by anti-Irish prejudice. The common English worker, he writes, hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers wages and the standard of life. Think also of immigrant labor at this time. He views him similarly to how the poor whites of the southern states of North America viewed black slaves. This antagonism among the proletarians of England is artificially nourished and kept up by the bourgeoisie. It knows that this split is the true secret of the preservation of his power, and even does a little culture critique. He says you can find it in the comic strips, in the newspapers. Moreover, the Irish independence struggle, he writes, could be the lever, this is in the polemic with Bakunin, could be the lever that would pry apart British and thus global capitalism. Here's what he writes. Although revolutionary initiative will probably come from France, England alone can serve as a lever for a serious economic revolution. It is the only country where the capitalist form, that is to say, combined labor on a large scale, under the authority of capitalists, has seized hold of almost the whole of production. The English have all the material conditions for social revolution. What they lack is a sense of generalization and revolutionary passion. It is only the General Council of the International that can provide them with this, that can thus accelerate the truly revolutionary movement in this country and consequently everywhere. If England is the bulwark of landlordism and European capitalism, The only place where official England can be struck a great blow is Ireland. This referred to Ireland's revolutionary peasantry, whose opposition to the system, he felt, was enhanced by a national factor. In other words, peasants everywhere probably hate their landlords, but in this case, it's a British landlord who's trying to impose Protestantism, not just Protestantism, the Anglican Church, on them, and having laws are discriminating, or there are laws of religious discrimination. Ireland is also where the landed aristocracy, part of the British ruling class, because he always sees it as both landlords and capitalists, had important holdings. In other words, they had holdings in Ireland as well as England very often. So, conclusion. I've tried to show that Marx's critique of capital was far broader than is usually supposed. To be sure, he concentrated on the labor-capital relation within Western Europe and North America. I'm not saying you should read only my book if you want an introduction to Marx. But at the same time, he expended considerable time and energy on the analysis of non-Western societies, as well as race, ethnicity, and nationalism in Western Europe and North America. These are also problems of our time, and it behooves us not only to stop attacking Marx for allegedly ignoring them, but also to see what we can learn from the ways in which he never separated these issues from the critique of capital, and at the same time took each of them seriously as social factors. So, a couple general comments for today. One could say that he began with a somewhat one-sided appreciation of capitalist modernity, of its progressiveness, but that he moved away from that toward a harsher critique of modernity. Now, you can see this not only in his writings on India, you can see his writings on labor and capital in England. This is a really strange thing to say, but he didn't really know that much about capitalism when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He never even lived in an advanced capitalist country. He moved to England in 1849. The Communist Manifesto has a lot of appreciation of capitalist progress. The Grundrisse, even 10 years later, has appreciation. You don't find praise of its progress in the same explicit way, but he says, you know, they're kind of developing the productive forces, and the workers will take that over eventually. But in capital, there's much less of that language in 1867 and later. The critique of capitalism actually becomes harsher, I would argue, in the book Capital. Commodity fetishism in Capital. Human relations are relations between things not because this is falsified, but because this is what they really are under modern capitalism. That's an incredibly harsh critique. It's also true of the chapter on machinery, where he argues that the most modern forms of technology as of his time served to deepen both the exploitation and the alienation of the worker, did not bring progress for the worker. So implications for today, though, of like what I was talking about earlier, you know, the ethnicity, nationalism, and non-Western societies, and his writings on that. Okay, first of all, at a general level, Marx's dialectic is not as abstractly universal as a lot of people think, as abstractly universalistic, but has more room than is usually realized for particulars and specifics like nation, ethnicity, and race. Second, Marx's late writings especially theorize indigenous forms of resistance to capital, as we can see in places like Chiapas or Bolivia today. And he also theorizes their need to connect to urban working class movements in more developed sectors or more developed countries. Now, I don't think these have the same force they did in 1880 because the world has become more urbanized and much more developed, and capital has penetrated much further into every pore of society in every part of the world. Nonetheless, it still has some relevance. Thirdly, these discussions of race and ethnicity and in relation to class in Ireland, I mean, I don't think I have to spell out the relation to the urban ghettos of the United States or to France, those kind of ghettos that they have where we saw an uprising just a few years ago. I think that part is clearly quite relevant to us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So, it's our time to get into questions and discussion. Give people a moment to catch their breath here. Yes, all the way back there.
We have books for sale from Blue Stockings, Calling the Iranian Revolution, Gender and Seduction of it. You know, your books.
Who's the author? Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Kevin B. Anderson. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
But and the Rosa Luxemburg Reader. So we have like 3 copies of these and 5 of these, and we take credit and cash. So buy them so I don't have to carry them back to the store.
Okay.
They're really good. I was reading them.
As a personal recommendation.
Yes.
Can you tell me specifically where Marx critiques the slave insurrections in the American South, and particularly the John Brown's insurrection?
Oh, it's in that book, The Civil War, Marx and Engels on the Civil War in the United States. It's a letter to Engels right at the time, like, what is that, December 1859. And what's interesting about the letter is he also talks about the Russian peasantry. He says there's 2 great things happening in the world today. One is the unrest among the Russian peasants, and the other is the possibility of a slave revolution in America. And he's talking a little loosely. He says a slave revolution may be also in Russia. Those are his words. That letter is pretty easily found. And there's other places in his early writings, the first period of his writings on the Civil War, because they had these, Lincoln got really scared by this and put a stop to it, but they had the Kansas Jayhawkers, as they were called. That's what John Brown called himself. So they were going down, they were taking units that, with white officers and black troops, and going in and basically, conducting harassment, going in and burning down slave plantations, and just showing, that they could operate in all the, even though they had seceded, that, the armed force of the North was going to be around. And some of that's captured, actually, if you saw the film Glory, it's captured, but it's not portrayed very positively. And so he writes about that too, that maybe he's too optimistic in his terms. He thinks that maybe this could spark a slave revolution in the South.